Awesome. Thanks for inviting me. It was really awesome opportunity. I start with this graphic because I think we have an immensity of information, and I work with data, and I'm really interested in taking some of that information and communicating it through sculpture, which is make physical forms, as a means to get towards knowledge. So in that basic sense, my practice isn't that different than a scientific practice, but I do not collect my own data. I use data from other resources and let scientists be experts in collecting data, and I take it into another realm from there. So I'm going to walk you through one piece from start to finish, which starts with inspiration and then the final piece, just to give you a sense of the full range of practice. This is a site in San Francisco. It's the former site of the Sutra Bathhouses. And I visited this site, and a lot of my work starts with a really personal experience in a natural place that invites inquiry and leads to a lot of research that ends in a piece. This is what the bathhouses looked like when they were built. They were the largest indoor swimming pool at the time. I believe in 1896 was when they were built. And they were 7 pools that were all tidal flows. So the tides would recycle the water every couple hours. 2 million gallons within 1 hour. And being at this site, you can walk around now. It's run by Golden Gate National Park. And you still get a sense for the most predominant natural phenomenon in this site is the tides, both in the way that humans had harnessed the tides previously for recreational purposes, but now that these ruins are just being taken back by the tides eventually as well. And this made me want to learn more about the tide cycles. So I do research. I use a lot of government open source databases that are searchable. The NOAA has an online archive, and the site in San Francisco is the longest continually operating tide station in the country, dating back to 1854, and you can search tide records all the way back. When you turn something as immense and beautiful as the tides into a quantification, it looks like this. So this is the raw data for 1 full day of tides. They take sea level every 6 minutes. You can also output a graph that the NOAA provides, and this is those numbers translated, interpreted into a line. And I take a full cycle of these for this site, which is 29 and a half days for the moon to go around the Earth, but I took 29 days because I couldn't really do a half. And I trace these and layer them, and it becomes something that tells me there's more to be had from this information, that there are patterns and cycles within it that I'd like to explore deeper and reveal, because they're not really seen. You can see them as a single line on a chart, but they don't really give you the full immense effect of the tides and what that cycle is. And so this is where I start trying to think 3-dimensionally with a lot of sketching, trying to figure out form and proportion. I definitely use both analog and digital prototyping techniques to turn that information into forms. I use digital mainly to stay as accurate to the data as I can, but again, there's always interpretation happening. These are flat bar steel that I've bent into each of those. I guess this is 1 week of tide data, and welded some tabs on there just to make this piece a little bit more structural and functional. And then that's the finished piece, which is referencing a table, but not functional. Function isn't really my focus. It's more about giving the body and the information an embodied presence so that a human, a person, can experience that data from a new perspective. I don't incorporate numbers or labels in my pieces because I want to show that pattern as something that can be experienced by the body. I think experience is really important to knowledge. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. It's fun to talk about work, but I'm also going to talk a lot about why I use data and why I think art and data and science really work well together. So despite its immensity, the data that is being collected and visualized represents only a sliver of human experience. I've looked a lot and done a lot more research recently and come up with some ideas about data and why I like using data and the relationship between data and information and knowledge. I haven't quite gotten to wisdom yet, but understanding that when I pull out data and I translate it into a visual form, it is no longer objective. The same way that when the NOAA takes those numbers and turns them into a graph, it is no longer completely objective because someone is choosing how it's represented. I believe that to get from information to knowledge, it's important that we think about contextual and synthesized learning, and that is part of experience for me. A lot of people assume that because I use data, I'm creating something that is truthful. And not me specifically, but there's a lot of data graphics that aren't actually truthful. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that might be. Most of you who are scientists know there's two types of data, qualitative and quantitative. There are hierarchies within science, and replicatable science is considered hard versus soft qualitative science. And what's easier to replicate is given more weight. But I want to point out that all quantitative data is subjective to qualitative judgments. Sorry, I'm not saying that quite well. What I mean by that is who funds scientific research definitely has impact on what is being studied, and this has to do with that small sliver of human experience being represented. So you can see there's big shifts within industry versus federal government funding of science. Women are greatly underrepresented in the sciences, which starts out about equal at high school and then progressively towards a Nobel Prize. Only 3% of Nobel Prizes are given to women. And then there's graphics like this that show you that people of color are also very significantly underrepresented in science. And so I think when we're talking about objectivity and methodologies between science and art, or just science in general, it's important to talk about some of the underlying factors that are at play within objectivity. Conversely, all qualitative data can be described and manipulated numerically. And anyone who's taken one of these tests, strongly agree, strongly disagree, knows what I mean by that, and that's aptly kind of represented in this graphic. So science can tell you how to clone a Tyrannosaurus Rex, but humanities can tell you why this might be a bad idea. I'm really interested in taking data and asking why and looking at the bigger picture in a broader context. I really have liked this quote by Blaise Pascal, who was a mathematician in the 1700s. Reason's last step is the recognition that there are an infinite number of things which are beyond it. So I'm not trying to undermine science. I obviously use a lot of data in my work, and I think it's absolutely wonderful, the work that's being done. But I like taking that data and using it as a conceptual resource to draw other conclusions and to put it into context within a greater experience of life. I think scientists sometimes can get a little frustrated with not allowing, with the practice not allowing a human element of emotion into their work sometimes. And you can see that in certain articles, and I'm happy to provide the sources for these if any of you are interested in that later. Climate depression is for real, just ask a scientist. This article is all about trauma and mental health of scientists studying climate change, which I've felt myself. Just reading certain scientific reports can be really, it has an impact on your emotions. Also this one, climate scientist drops the F-bomb after startling Arctic discovery. It's interesting when there's so much attention drawn, like why, when studying things that have huge impacts in our lives, are we not allowed to be human and have a human response to those, the things that are being studied? And I think that's something that art can help get out in terms of communication, but also that broader perspective of experience that I'm talking about. And I think that's really important to science. So there's this graphic that sort of boils it down. We've got the data. Information and presentation, I sort of think are the same thing. It's the communication side of things. It's the interpretation into a presentable format. And then knowledge. And people get confused about why the cake is no longer there. And I think that the knowledge in this analogy is when you eat the cake, that's the experience of eating the cake is really what has the impact. And that's that synthesized learning that I was talking about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about art as experience because that's what I do. John Dewey was a really prolific American philosopher, educator, and activist. He had a major influence on educational reform in this country in the first half of the 20th century. He was very active. He wrote this book that is phenomenal, and one of the main threads of this book is that when we think of art, we tend to think of art as objects, and this is a mistake. That's what John Dewey believes. Art is actually two parts of experience. One is the experience of that person who's making the work, and then once the work is made, the experience of the people who are then perceiving it. And he called this the doing and the undergoing. Brian Eno has this quote going around as well, which actually he didn't write, but he's quoted someone else. Stop thinking about artworks as objects and start thinking about them as triggers for experiences. So I'm trying to get at why I think experience is critical in that synthesized learning and how taking data into an experience can be a really effective way to have an emotional impact and really reach a broader audience. I'm going to talk about a couple other pieces I've made using different data sets. This one started because I learned this photo here is the Colorado River at the end, the delta, which no longer hits the ocean anymore. And that's a pretty huge impact. It's the largest river in the West. And this really made me wonder, where's all that water going? What are we using it for? Which led me to a really wonderful USGS report on national water consumption statistics that compiled the whole nation from 1950 to 2000. You can see this central bar is actually an information graphic. So that yellow segment is about 48% of all the water in the country, and that's all used for power generation. The second most is that green segment, which is used for irrigation, and then it's split up into those other smaller categories, 8 in total. So I took the 2 largest and 3 below that and started to graph them into a physical form that I wanted to make, relying on my experience growing up, driving all over the West. I grew up in Colorado, so seeing arid landscapes and really having the form help to articulate the idea of what we're using water for by relating it to an arid landscape. So this is a canyon form. This is the point at which I'm sketching a concept, but it's not actually applying the data to this form. But I have a rough idea looking at the numbers. In my head, I can translate numbers into a form and have a general sense of how the form's going to come together. It takes a lot of work to do that, but I'm getting better at it. At that point, I'll go into a CAD program a few steps farther than Illustrator to make a 3-dimensional model digitally. And then again, that's to stay as accurate as I can to the data. You can see I've taken the different categorical uses, had this river shape from the top view, and then applied those different uses to different segments of the river. And then this gives me my 2D parts that I cut out of plywood in this case. And then I glue them back up into a solid form. I use a lot of grinders and abrasive materials and safety equipment, of course, and skipped a whole bunch of the process, but you get the idea of going from that stepped form to a completely smooth surface. So you can see in this front view, we've got 1950 at the top, 2000 at the bottom, and that's irrigation. So the walls of this canyon are getting wider or skinnier based on how much water we're using for different categorical uses. On this other side, you can see that's power generation. So it was much smaller in 1950 and has ballooned out, kind of equalized down towards the bottom. So this is where I grew up. The mountains have had a profound impact on me, and it's one of my main inspirations. Nature in general and being in natural settings, and I do travel a lot to national parks just to get inspiration. It's a really big part of my practice. And snow has had a big influence on one piece I've made. And all of the snow data is collected under the SNOTEL system, which is snowpack telemetry. And the National Resources Conservation Service is the organization that compiles all that data. You can see you can search for much more criteria. You can get soil moisture, precipitation, air temperature, accumulated precipitation. There's quite a lot that you can search and just online get access to a ton of different data sets. And what I'm trying to get at with making these things physical is a little bit more of that sense of what it feels like to be enveloped in snow. And that's why I make sculpture and not just graphics or data visualization pieces. This is one water year of snow water equivalent data. Of course, that's measuring how much water is actually in the snowpack as opposed to the depth of the snow. It's a much more accurate reading. And they track that for predicting runoff for agriculture and public use. So I've taken the full range of data sets for this one particular site at Ebbets Pass. And then you can see there's a bit of variety in what you see. That's 31 years of snow graphs compiled into one graphic. And then I start to sketch how they might be created into a physical form. And it evolves quite a bit. So looking primarily at trying to suss out what is the most important part of this data and how it's being represented. The first snowfall to the last, melt off and the peak amount. And then the process of fabrication, in this case, again, sculpted plywood. Plywood's a great way for me to be able to index like even sheets that I can cut to a very accurate shape and then carve back. And it helps me stay as accurate to the data as possible. So this piece ended up becoming a cabinet. And the reason I chose a functional piece was because I wanted to be a correlation between snow as this natural way that water is stored in nature and then comes out, in summer when it melts off. And thinking about the human element and the human experience of where we store things, and there being a correlation between how much water is available and how much space you have available in this drawer. Some of these drawers are only 1/4 of an inch deep. They're not very functional, but you can see the graph is essentially the top of the drawer when you open it, and that's the full piece in its height. Down at the bottom is the El Nino. There's a much deeper drawer. So you can start to see longer term trends. You can imagine if you had more data to work with, you'd get to see a lot more patterns coming out of this. I've worked a bit with scientists as well. I do try to collaborate. Scientists aren't always super interested in collaborating with artists. In this case, I was in Oregon for a residency, so I took this graphic, which is from 1944 of the Mississippi River meander belt. And I took it to some scientists at the USGS Oregon Water Science Center and asked them if they had anything similar, and they said, no, it's not going to look anything like that. But that was the point. I wanted to see something local to Oregon. They provided me with these LiDAR maps of a segment of the Molalla River, in which there was a flood between 2005 and 2009. So you can see there's a new arm of this river that had developed. I interpolated the in-between layers so that they would all connect and make a fluid form, and then cut them out of plywood in this case as well. That's a CNC router, which is a computer numerical controlled router that will cut out the parts very accurately to the drawings I created in the computer. And then that's the finished piece after it's all carved down and from a side view there. More recently, I've been looking at fire fire data. This is a satellite imagery of the Rim Fire in 2013, which was the third largest wildfire in California history. Earlier this year, I was down at San Diego State doing a residency, and this is the Cedar Fire, a fire progression map that shows time-stamped perimeters of that fire as it grew and changed shape over time. This was the largest California wildfire in history in 2003. And I ended up creating a three-dimensional rendering, essentially a model of this fire, but instead of having it flat, I extrapolated the z-axis, the height, to show time. So you can see that at the start, it starts very small. It grew one direction, and then something changed, maybe the wind or some sort of geography pushed it the other direction. Then as it gets to the higher points, it starts to dissipate a bit more. So following the perimeter, you can end up with a sort of a void form. And this is just modeling clay with an armature underneath. It's a great way for me to have a lot of control over the form, which is a really complex form to try and draw in a computer, but still have the ability to get the effect of that form. And reveal something about that fire. And every fire looks different, so I've been working with a few different fire maps on this, and eventually it will not be clay anymore. It'll be a much larger piece, probably out of wood of some sort. I have a bunch of wood from the Rim Fire that I've collected when that happened, so that will hopefully become a bigger piece. This is the last piece I'm going to talk about. It is inspired by a glacial retreat. I spent a month in Alaska and have been back several times since, doing a residency, and in which I met a lot of scientists in the area. The Kachemak Bay Research Reserve has kind of the best data on glacial retreat in that area. Unfortunately, there's not great data on how much mass is being lost from glaciers because they haven't really been recording it. But they do know how much they've been retreating in rates per year. So this first glacier, Gruink, is one that I was able to map out. And this was some of the maps that were provided to me by Steve Baird, who's a researcher at the Kachemak Bay Research Reserve. And basically all they've got are perimeter map, both from aerial imagery and also from observations. You know, that first line in the 1800s, that was somebody who was up there hiking around and saw the glacier. There was no lake at that time. This is what it looks like a couple years ago. That's the tip of the glacier, and you can't come right up to it because there's quite a big lake there. That's me collecting water for artistic purposes. And this is me taking that time and extrapolating it again. So showing how that shape has receded over time as a physical form, which I then translate into plywood in this case. But plywood doesn't really give you the effect of something disappearing or the transparency or really the idea of ice and water. In this case, I wanted to translate it into a material that had more of that affective reference. And so this is a process of creating a mold from that form. So that pink is a silicone rubber, and then that part behind it is a hydrocal, which is like a plaster. So you create this rubber which catches a lot of the detail in the form, and then this mother mold is what the outside shell is called, and that helps hold it so that it has shape and doesn't just flop around when you fill it up with the material you're casting. And this I used both snow melt and tried a lot of different types of water to cast into, and that's it in the freezer. And then the finished piece, you can see there's some of the detail of those plywood lines that was captured in the silicone and translated into the ice. And then I've got a video documentation of it melting in 1 day's time, and I'm going to read a quote to end us out. It's from a book called A General Theory of Love. We demand too much if we expect single-handed empiricism to define and lay bare the human soul. Only in concert with art does science become so precise. The smokestack in the background was a kiln that was firing a ceramic load that day. It was at an art center in Colorado. Thank you.